What if I told you that every single night, while you lie there with your eyes closed, thinking you're doing nothing more than resting, you're actually wasting the most powerful 8 hours you'll ever have access to? That's right. Those precious hours of sleep that most people treat as dead time, as nothing more than a biological necessity to recharge your batteries, could actually be the secret weapon you've been searching for to completely transform your life. Think about it for a moment. You spend roughly 1/3 of your entire existence in a state we call sleep. If you live to be 90 years old, that's 30 years, 3 full decades of your life spent in what most people consider to be unconsciousness. 30 years that society tells you are simply lost time. Necessary, yes, but essentially wasted as far as productivity and personal growth are concerned. But what if everything we've been taught about sleep is fundamentally wrong? What if those hours of darkness, those moments when your conscious mind finally stops its endless chattering and analyzing and worrying, aren't wasted at all? What if they're actually the most sophisticated laboratory for personal transformation that exists anywhere in the known universe? A laboratory that's been operating inside you every single night of your life, waiting for you to learn how to use it properly. Has this ever happened to you? You go to bed exhausted, your mind spinning with a problem that seems absolutely impossible to solve. You've been thinking about it all day, turning it over from every angle, and you're no closer to an answer than when you started. So you give up, frustrated, and fall asleep. Then you wake up the next morning and suddenly, almost magically, the solution is right there, crystal clear, as if someone had been working on it while you slept. Because someone was. You were. But before we begin diving deeper into this fascinating phenomenon, please hit the like button and let me know where in the world you're watching from today. It's always fascinating seeing who's joining us from around the world. And if you haven't already, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any of our future videos. Stay with me until the end of this video, because what you're about to discover might completely change the way you think about sleep, about consciousness, and about your own untapped potential. Scientists are only now beginning to understand what ancient wisdom traditions have known for thousands of years, that the sleeping state isn't a shutdown of consciousness at all. It's a shift into a different mode of operation, one that's actually far more powerful in certain ways than your waking mind could ever be. Your sleeping brain doesn't rest. It works, but it works differently. It processes, reorganizes, and creates in ways that your conscious mind simply cannot replicate. And here's where it gets really interesting. When you learn to work with this process intentionally, when you discover how to plant the right seeds just before you drift off, you can wake up to find that your entire reality has shifted in ways you never thought possible. Now, here's something that might surprise you. This isn't some new age discovery or modern self-help gimmick. The truth is, this knowledge is ancient, thousands of years old, in fact. The civilizations that built the pyramids of Egypt, the mystery schools of Alexandria, the sacred temples high in the mountains of Tibet, they all understood something profound about the night that we've somehow forgotten in our modern rush toward constant productivity and endless stimulation. These weren't primitive people making lucky guesses. They were sophisticated observers of consciousness who spent lifetimes studying the hidden mechanics of the human mind. When they oriented their temples toward specific stars, when they designed chambers that would capture the first light of dawn in just the right way, when they developed elaborate rituals around the transition from day to night, they weren't just being superstitious. They were working with a technology of consciousness that we're only now beginning to rediscover through neuroscience and sleep research. The ancient masters understood that nighttime isn't empty space, isn't wasted hours. They saw it as sacred territory, a dimension where the threads of human destiny are actually woven together. where the fabric of your future reality is being constructed moment by moment in the darkness. And the most fascinating part, you're the one holding the loom. You're the weaver. You just don't realize it yet because nobody ever taught you how to work with this process intentionally. But there's a specific moment, a precise window of opportunity that opens every single night, that the ancients paid particular attention to. It's that threshold moment, that liminal space between being awake and being asleep. You know, the feeling I'm talking about, that strange floaty sensation when you're still somewhat aware, but your thoughts start to drift and become dreamlike. When reality begins to soften around the edges and your mind starts to wander into territories it wouldn't dare explore during the harsh light of day. If this resonates with you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the deeper teachings that build on what we've explored today. There's so much more to uncover together. This isn't just a random transition phase. It's actually the most important moment of your entire day, at least in terms of personal transformation, because in this brief window, this threshold between worlds, as the ancient texts called it, something extraordinary happens inside your brain. All those psychological defenses you've built up over the years, all those filters and barriers that normally protect you from uncomfortable truths or challenging ideas, they start to power down. Your critical mind, that voice that constantly questions and doubts and analyzes everything, begins to fade into the background. And in that moment of reduced resistance, your subconscious mind becomes extraordinarily receptive. It's like fertile soil that's been perfectly prepared, waiting for seeds to be planted. Whatever impressions you give your mind during this threshold moment, whatever thoughts or intentions or declarations you consciously choose to focus on, they sink deep into your psyche without the usual resistance. They bypass all the normal gatekeepers and land directly in the control center of your belief systems and behavioral patterns. This is where the real magic happens, where genuine transformation becomes possible in a way that simply cannot occur during your normal waking hours. Think about all the times you've tried to change something about yourself during the day. You set an intention, you make a decision, you tell yourself you're going to be different from now on. And what happens? Your conscious mind immediately starts throwing up objections. Your past failures parade through your memory. Your inner critic starts listing all the reasons why it won't work. The resistance is enormous, but in that threshold moment before sleep, that resistance dissolves. The pathway to your deepest programming lies wide open, unguarded, ready to receive new instructions. And this is exactly what the ancient wisdom keepers understood and used to create profound shifts in consciousness, to heal what seemed unhealable, to manifest what seemed impossible. Now, I want to go even deeper into this because understanding the mechanics of why this works is crucial to actually using it effectively. What's really happening in your brain during this transition isn't mystical, it's neurological. Your brainwave patterns are shifting from beta waves, which dominate during active thinking, down through alpha into theta frequencies. Theta is the realm where your subconscious mind becomes directly accessible, where the boundary between conscious and unconscious thought becomes permeable. In this state, your brain is doing something remarkable behind the scenes. It's consolidating memories, yes, but it's also reorganizing neural pathways, strengthening certain connections while pruning others. The decisions about which pathways to strengthen and which to weaken, they're influenced by what you're focusing on in those final moments before you drift off. Your last thoughts, your final mental images, your closing declarations about yourself and your reality, these aren't just floating away into nothing, they're being woven into the very structure of who you're becoming. Write in the comments, I'm ready to use this threshold, if something about what I've just shared resonates with you on a deeper level. The reason this threshold moment is so powerful becomes even clearer when you look at what happens after you've crossed it. You've probably experienced this yourself countless times without realizing what was actually going on behind the scenes. You go to bed with your mind churning over some problem that feels completely unsolvable. Maybe it's a difficult decision you need to make at work, a conflict in a relationship that seems to have no good resolution, or a creative challenge where you've hit a wall and just can't see the way forward. You've spent hours thinking about it. You've analyzed it from every possible angle. You've made lists of pros and cons. You've talked it through with friends. You've Google searched for advice. And yet, despite all this conscious effort, the answer remains frustratingly out of reach. So eventually, exhausted and defeated, you give up and go to sleep. And then something remarkable happens. You wake up the next morning and there it is, the solution, perfectly clear, almost obvious, sitting right there in your awareness, as if it had been there all along, just waiting for you to notice it. Most people write, "This offers coincidence or luck." They think maybe their brain just needed a rest, that sleep somehow refreshed their thinking. But that's not really what's happening at all. What's actually occurring is far more deliberate and far more profound. While you slept, while your conscious mind was offline and no longer interfering with the process, your subconscious mind, which is vastly more powerful and has access to infinitely more information than your waking awareness, went to work on that problem. It sorted through millions of data points from your entire life experience, connected dots that your conscious mind would never think to connect, explored solution pathways that your waking logic would immediately dismiss as impossible or impractical. And it did all of this without the interference of what I call the guardian of consciousness, that relentless filter that stands at the gate of your perception during every waking moment, deciding what gets in and what gets rejected. This guardian is both your greatest protection and your greatest limitation. During the day, it's working overtime, scrutinizing every new thought, every fresh idea, every innovative solution that tries to enter your awareness. And what criteria does it use to judge whether something should be allowed in? Your past, your previous experiences, your accumulated beliefs about what's possible and what's impossible, what works and what doesn't, who you are and who you're not. The guardian's job is to keep you safe, to maintain consistency, to protect you from making reckless decisions or believing things that might lead you astray. It's constantly comparing every new input against the database of everything you've already experienced and concluded. If a new idea doesn't match the existing patterns, if it contradicts your established worldview, if it suggests possibilities that fall outside the boundaries of what you've already proven to yourself is real, the guardian automatically blocks it. Immediately, without conscious deliberation. This is why personal transformation is so incredibly difficult during your waking hours. Every time you try to adopt a new belief about yourself, every time you attempt to imagine a reality that's significantly different from your current circumstances, every time you declare that you're going to be someone or do something or achieve something that contradicts your historical track record, the guardian steps in and shuts it down. It whispers in your ear, "Who are you kidding? You've tried this before and it didn't work. Remember all those previous failures? Remember how you are? This isn't realistic. This isn't you. Stay in your lane. Stay safe within the boundaries of what you already know is true about yourself and the world." And here's the devastating truth that most people never realize. That protective guardian, with all its well-intentioned filtering and gatekeeping, is the very mechanism that keeps you trapped in repetitive patterns, living the same year over and over again, unable to break through into genuinely new territory. Because anything truly new, anything authentically transformative, by definition won't match your past experience. It will contradict your existing evidence. It will require you to believe in possibilities that your historical data doesn't support. But when you cross that threshold into sleep, something miraculous happens. The Guardian clocks out. It goes offline. For the first time in your entire waking day, the gate stands completely unguarded, and in that undefended space, your consciousness gains access to realms of possibility that are permanently sealed off during your normal waking state. Solutions that would have been instantly rejected as unrealistic or impossible can now be explored freely. Connections between seemingly unrelated ideas can now be made without immediate dismissal. This is the hidden truth behind those morning moments of clarity and revelation. Your sleeping mind isn't just resting, it's free from the tyranny of your past, free from the limitations of your accumulated beliefs, free to explore the full spectrum of what's actually possible, rather than being confined to the narrow slice of what you've already proven to yourself. Write in the comments, "The Guardian is asleep," if you're beginning to understand why your nighttime hours hold power that your daytime efforts can never quite access. And this is where the real transformation begins to happen, in that sacred space where the Guardian has finally stepped aside. Think of it this way. Imagine you've been living your entire life in a house where one particularly strict family member controls the front door. Every time someone new tries to visit, every time a different idea wants to come in, every time an opportunity knocks, this Guardian at the door interviews them first. They ask for credentials. They check references against a list of previously approved visitors. They compare every newcomer to people who've been allowed in before. If anything seems unfamiliar, if anyone doesn't match the established pattern, they're turned away before they can even step inside. That's your waking consciousness. That's what your daytime mind does with every single possibility that presents itself. But when you fall asleep, it's as if that strict Guardian finally takes a break, walks away from the door, and leaves it wide open. And in rush all these possibilities, these solutions, these perspectives that would never have made it past the screening process during daylight hours. What makes this even more remarkable is the sheer processing power that gets unleashed when your conscious mind stops interfering. Your waking awareness, as sophisticated as it seems, is actually extraordinarily limited in terms of what it can handle at any given moment. Neuroscientists estimate that your conscious mind can process somewhere around 40 to 50 bits of information per second. That sounds like a lot until you realize that your unconscious mind, the vast intelligence operating beneath the surface, is processing approximately 11 million bits of information per second. If something shifted inside you while watching this, if you feel like you've discovered something genuinely valuable, show it by hitting that like button. It's a small gesture that helps this message find the people who are ready for it. Let that sink in for a moment. 11 million versus 50. It's not even close. It's like comparing a candle to the sun in terms of brightness and power. Your sleeping mind has access to computational abilities that make your waking thoughts look like a child's calculator next to a supercomputer. And during those precious hours of sleep, this supercomputer isn't bound by the usual constraints. It can run wild, exploring thousands upon thousands of possible combinations, testing scenarios that your waking mind would never have the patience or the courage to consider. It's diving into memories you didn't even know you had, pulling up experiences from decades ago that somehow hold the key to your current challenge. It's making connections across completely different domains of your life, linking something you learned in childhood to a problem you're facing in your career, connecting a pattern from a past relationship to a decision you need to make about your health, weaving together threads of experience that your conscious mind keeps in separate, unconnected boxes. And the most liberating part of this whole process, it all happens without the constant friction of doubt. Think about how much energy you spend during the day second-guessing yourself, questioning your choices, wondering if you're doing the right thing or making a terrible mistake. That exhausting internal debate, that paralysis of analysis, it's completely absent during sleep. Your unconscious mind doesn't waste time worrying about whether it's on the right track. It just explores, creates, connects, and solves with absolute fluidity. There's no fear of failure haunting every step because your sleeping consciousness isn't operating under the same threat assessment protocols that dominate your waking hours. During the day, every decision feels weighty because your mind is constantly calculating worst-case scenarios, running risk assessments, imagining all the ways things could go wrong. That's the guardian again, doing its job of keeping you safe. But that same protective mechanism also keeps you small, keeps you stuck, keeps you from accessing the full range of your creative and problem-solving capabilities. When you're asleep, though, that fear-based filtering system is offline. Your mind can play with possibilities freely, can experiment with solutions boldly, can venture into territory that would feel far too risky during waking hours. And because there's no fear of being wrong, no anxiety about making mistakes, the quality and creativity of the solutions it generates are often exponentially better than anything your conscious mind could produce through deliberate effort. This is why the answers that come to you in the morning often feel so effortless, so obvious in hindsight. They don't come wrapped in doubt or hedged with qualifications. They arrive with a clarity and certainty that your daytime thinking rarely achieves, because they were crafted in an environment free from the constant static of fear and self-questioning that normally clouds your judgment. But here's what most people miss, and this is crucial to understand if you want to actually harness this power rather than just accidentally benefiting from it occasionally. This whole miraculous process, the guardian stepping aside, the exponential processing power kicking in, the fear-free exploration of possibilities, it's already happening every single night, whether you're aware of it or not. The question isn't whether your sleeping mind is working on your behalf. It always is. The question is, what raw material are you giving it to work with? Put "my mind is processing solutions right now" in the comments if you're starting to recognize that something powerful has been happening behind the scenes of your sleep all along. Because here's the thing that separates those who accidentally stumble upon breakthroughs from those who consistently engineer them: intention. The ancient masters who studied consciousness for lifetimes understood something that modern science is only now beginning to validate. They called it the alchemy of sleep, and they weren't speaking metaphorically. They meant it literally. Just as the alchemists of old claimed to transform base metals into gold through precise processes and specific conditions, these consciousness explorers discovered that sleep provides the exact environment needed to transform your most limiting beliefs into your most empowering truths. The comparison to alchemy isn't random or poetic. It's actually remarkably accurate. Traditional alchemists worked in laboratories where they could control temperature, pressure, and chemical combinations with extreme precision. They understood that transformation requires specific conditions, that you can't just throw random ingredients together and hope for gold. You need the right environment, the right catalysts, the right sequence of operations. And what these ancient wisdom keepers realized is that your mind during sleep is the most perfect alchemical laboratory that exists anywhere in nature. Think about what happens when night falls and you finally disconnect from the external world. All day long, you've been bombarded by stimuli. Your senses have been under constant assault from sights, sounds, conversations, notifications, demands on your attention, pulling you in 1,000 different directions simultaneously. Your nervous system has been in a state of perpetual response mode, reacting to whatever the environment throws at you. There's been no stillness, no real quiet, no genuine isolation from the chaos of external circumstances. But when you lie down in darkness and close your eyes, something fundamental shifts. The laboratory of your inner world finally gets the conditions it needs to do deep work. The temperature drops, both literally in your body and metaphorically in terms of the intensity of mental activity. The pressure releases, all those external demands and expectations temporarily fade away. The distractions disappear. In the darkness and silence, there's nowhere else to look, nothing else demanding your immediate attention. This is when genuine transformation becomes possible. Not the surface-level changes you can force through willpower and discipline during the day, but the deep structural shifts that actually rewire who you are at your core. The kind of change that doesn't require constant effort to maintain because it's happened at the foundational level of your identity and belief systems. But here's where most people squander this incredible opportunity. They treat bedtime as just the end of the day, a time to collapse in exhaustion and escape from their problems for a few hours. They bring all the garbage of the day with them into bed. The stress, the worries, the replaying of difficult conversations, the anxious thoughts about tomorrow's challenges. And then they wonder why they wake up feeling just as heavy and burdened as when they went to sleep. Why nothing ever really changes, despite their best daytime efforts. What they don't understand is that those final moments before sleep are like the alchemist standing at the entrance to the laboratory, about to begin the night's work. And the question that determines everything is, what ingredients are you bringing into the lab with you? Are you walking in with fear, doubt, and limiting beliefs, expecting your unconscious mind to somehow transform those toxic materials into golden possibilities? Or are you deliberately, consciously choosing the raw materials you want your sleeping mind to work with? The ancient practitioners knew that you can't leave this to chance. They developed specific practices, precise techniques for seeding the unconscious mind with exactly the right intentions just before crossing that threshold into sleep. They understood that in those liminal moments, when the guardian is drowsy and about to clock out completely, you have a brief window of opportunity to slip new programming past the usual defenses, to plant seeds in soil that will be perfectly receptive throughout the night, allowing those seeds to germinate and grow in the ideal conditions of darkness, stillness, and isolation from external interference. This is the hidden truth that changes everything. Your sleeping hours aren't just passive recovery time. They're active transformation time, whether you're directing that transformation consciously or allowing it to happen randomly based on whatever thoughts happen to be dominating your mind when you drifted off. The laboratory is always operating. The alchemical processes are always running. The only question is whether you're using them deliberately or accidentally. And the difference between deliberate and accidental use of this power? It's the difference between stumbling upon gold occasionally by pure luck and knowing exactly how to create it consistently, night after night, using principles that have been tested and refined over thousands of years of human exploration into the deepest mysteries of consciousness and transformation. Right, I'm entering the laboratory consciously tonight. In the comments, if you're realizing that you've been given access to something extraordinary that's been there all along, just waiting for you to learn how to use it intentionally. So, let me ask you something that might hit close to home. What was going through your mind the last time you went to bed? And I don't mean what you were thinking about during the day, I mean those specific thoughts occupying your awareness in those final moments before you drifted off. Were you mentally rehearsing that difficult conversation you had with your boss, running it through your mind over and over, thinking about all the things you should have said differently? Were you worrying about money, calculating bills in your head, imagining worst-case scenarios about how you're going to make ends meet next month? Maybe you were replaying that awkward social interaction, cringing at something you said, convinced everyone thinks you're weird or incompetent. Or perhaps you were projecting into tomorrow, running through all the things that could go wrong, all the challenges waiting for you, building anxiety about situations that haven't even happened yet, and probably never will. If you're like most people, your mind in those pre-sleep moments is a chaotic storm of regrets about the past and fears about the future. And here's the devastating reality of what's actually happening when you do this. Remember that perfect alchemical laboratory we just talked about? Remember those ideal conditions for transformation that your sleeping mind provides? Well, you're walking into that pristine laboratory carrying buckets of toxic waste. You're contaminating the very environment that's meant to be working miracles on your behalf. It's like a scientist preparing to conduct a delicate experiment in a sterile lab, but right before starting, they dump garbage all over the workbench and then wonder why the experiment fails. Your unconscious mind is incredibly obedient. It doesn't judge the ingredients you give it. It doesn't say, wait, these thoughts are terrible for you, so I'm going to ignore them and work with something better instead. No, it takes whatever you're feeding it in those final conscious moments and says, okay, this must be what we're working with tonight. This must be what's important. This must be the reality we're building. And then it spends the next 8 hours processing, amplifying, and weaving those worries and fears into the fabric of your tomorrow. This is the costly mistake that keeps people trapped in cycles of anxiety and limitation year after year. They're accidentally using the most powerful transformation tool they possess to reinforce exactly the patterns they desperately want to escape from. Every night, they're essentially programming their subconscious mind with instructions that say, more of this, please. More worry, more fear, more of the same problems I already have. And then they wake up and wonder why nothing ever changes, why they feel stuck, why their efforts at personal growth during the day seem to go nowhere. But what if you could flip this completely? What if, instead of poisoning your inner laboratory, you could seed it with exactly the right ingredients for the transformation you actually want? This is where the ancient wisdom becomes immediately practical, where thousands of years of consciousness exploration translate into something you can use tonight. Because what those masters developed wasn't vague philosophy or abstract spirituality. It was a technology, a precise, repeatable system for communicating with your unconscious mind in the language it actually understands and responds to. See, your sleeping consciousness doesn't process information the way your waking mind does. It doesn't think in logic and linear sequences and rational arguments. It thinks in images, in symbols, in feelings, in rhythms. It responds to certain cadences of thought that bypass the analytical filters. It opens up to specific types of declarations that resonate at frequencies your daytime mind can't quite access. The ancients spent lifetimes mapping out exactly what works and what doesn't, testing different approaches, refining the techniques until they had it down to a science. They discovered which words carry the most power when whispered in that threshold moment. They identified the rhythm and pacing that allows intentions to sink deepest into the receptive soil of the unconscious. They learned how to construct internal images that the sleeping mind recognizes as important and worthy of being woven into the fabric of your future reality. This wasn't guesswork or wishful thinking. It was systematic exploration of consciousness, as rigorous in its own way as any modern scientific research, just operating with different tools and methods. And the beautiful thing about this technology is that it's not complicated. It doesn't require years of training or special abilities. It just requires understanding a few key principles about how your mind actually works during that transition from waking to sleeping, and then applying those principles consistently. The impact of using this knowledge versus not using it is the difference between being blown around by random winds and knowing how to adjust your sails to catch the exact breeze that will carry you where you want to go. Drop "I'm learning the language" in the comments if you're ready to start communicating with your unconscious mind in ways it actually understands, rather than continuing to speak a language it doesn't respond to. Now let me share a story with you that brings all of this into sharp focus, because sometimes abstract principles only really make sense when you see them played out in a real human life. There was a merchant named Mikhail who lived in ancient Damascus, in the heart of the bustling silk trade that connected east and west. He came from a family that had built their reputation over generations as masters of their craft. His grandfather, his father, even his great-grandfather before him, they were all known throughout the region as people who could identify the finest silks by touch alone, who commanded top prices for their goods, who seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to know which traders to trust and which opportunities to pursue. But when the business passed to Mikhail, something fundamental broke. It wasn't that he lacked knowledge or skill. He'd been trained his entire life. He knew everything his ancestors had taught him about silk quality, about market conditions, about negotiation tactics, and yet every single decision he made seemed to lead to disaster. He'd invest in a shipment that seemed promising, and it would be delayed or damaged. He'd trust a trading partner his instincts said was reliable, and they'd disappear with his money. He'd choose to stock certain products based on all his expertise, and demand would inexplicably shift to something else entirely. His competitors flourished while he struggled. His family's once thriving business dwindled to almost nothing. And the worst part was that he couldn't understand why. He was doing everything right according to all the knowledge he'd been given. He was working harder than anyone else in the marketplace. He was making logical decisions based on sound reasoning, and yet failure followed him like a shadow. What Mikhail didn't realize, what he couldn't see because it was happening at a level below his conscious awareness, was that the real problem had nothing to do with his daytime strategies or market knowledge. The true source of his repeated failures was what was happening in those moments just before he fell asleep each night. Exhausted from another disappointing day, humiliated by another loss, terrified about his dwindling resources and his family's crumbling legacy, Mikhail would lie awake in the darkness, replaying his mistakes. He'd review every bad decision, every failed venture, every moment that proved he wasn't worthy of the family name. And as he finally drifted off, the last thoughts running through his mind were variations on a single theme. I'm a failure. I'm not like my ancestors. I'll never be successful. Everything I touch turns to ruin. Night after night, he was programming his unconscious mind with these declarations of inadequacy and doom. And his unconscious mind, being the obedient servant it is, was working tirelessly throughout his sleep to make those declarations come true, to organize his perceptions and decisions in ways that would confirm the reality he kept asserting in that powerful threshold moment. He was using the alchemical laboratory perfectly, just in reverse, transforming gold into lead instead of lead into gold. Then one evening, as Mikhail sat alone in his nearly empty stall, surrounded by the few remaining bolts of silk that represented the last remnants of his family's legacy, an elderly woman appeared. She wasn't a customer. She didn't look like she had money to spend. But there was something in her eyes, some quality of knowing that made him pay attention despite his despair. She walked slowly through his stall, running her weathered fingers across the silk, and then she said something that would change everything. "This silk is crying. It remembers when people spoke to it with power." Mikhail thought she was senile at first. Silk doesn't cry, silk doesn't remember anything, but she continued, unfazed by his skepticism. She told him that his ancestors had known a secret that had been lost, not because it was deliberately hidden, but because each generation had stopped believing it could be true. They had understood that everything, absolutely everything, including the fabric of silk and the fabric of human destiny, responds to certain words spoken at certain times with certain conviction. The old woman explained that his forefathers didn't just trade in silk, they worked with it, spoke to it, and most importantly, they aligned their own consciousness with abundance and success in those sacred hours when the veil between worlds becomes thin. Every night, in that moment just before sleep, they would make declarations beginning with the most powerful two words in any language. I am, not I want, or I hope, or I wish. Those are weak phrases that position what you desire as separate from you, as something you lack. But I am declares a present reality. It asserts identity. It claims ownership of a truth right now, not someday in the uncertain future. His ancestors would whisper, I am prosperity, as they drifted off to sleep. I am success. I am wisdom in all my dealings. I am worthy of my family's legacy. And their unconscious minds, receiving these declarations in that moment of maximum receptivity, would spend the night weaving that reality into being, organizing opportunities, sharpening intuitions, guiding decisions in ways that manifested exactly what had been declared. Put, I am ready to declare, in the comments. If something is stirring in you as you hear this, if some part of you recognizes that you've been declaring the wrong things in your most powerful moments, and that it's time to change what you're telling your unconscious mind about who you are and what's possible for you. Mikkel stood there in his empty stall, holding that last piece of silk, and the woman's instructions echoed in his mind. 7 nights, just 7 consecutive nights of placing his hand on the fabric and whispering, I am abundance, in that precise moment when sleep was pulling him under. That was all she asked. 7 nights of what felt like absolute foolishness, of talking to cloth like it could hear him, of declaring prosperity when everything around him screamed failure. But what did he have to lose at this point? His business was already destroyed. His reputation was already in ruins. What was one more week of humiliation, even if only witnessed by himself in the privacy of his own bed? So that first night, feeling utterly ridiculous, he lay down with the silk draped across his chest. He waited for that familiar feeling, that sensation of consciousness beginning to blur and drift, the moment when thoughts start to lose their sharp edges and reality begins to soften. And then, with as much conviction as he could summon while feeling like a complete fool, he placed his hand on the fabric and whispered, I am abundance. What happened next he would later describe as something that defied all rational explanation. The silk under his palm, this inanimate piece of cloth that should have remained cool and unchanged, began to warm. Not dramatically, not like fire or heat from an external source, but subtle, unmistakable warmth spreading from where his hand made contact with the fabric. It was as if the material itself was responding, recognizing. Something in those words, in that declaration, in the frequency of his intentions spoken at precisely the right moment. He pulled his hand away, startled, convinced he was imagining it. But when he placed it back, the sensation returned. The silk wasn't just warm, it was almost vibrating, pulsing with some kind of energy that hadn't been there moments before. And as he drifted off to sleep, with his hand still resting on that warm fabric, something in his unconscious mind registered that something had shifted, that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as crazy as it seemed. The second night, he returned to the practice with less skepticism and more curiosity. Again, in that threshold moment, he whispered the words. Again, the warmth spread beneath his palm. But this time, something else happened too. As he slept, his dreams were different. Instead of the usual nightmares of failure and loss, instead of the anxiety-ridden scenarios that normally plagued his rest, he found himself dreaming of the marketplace as it had been in his grandfather's time, bustling, prosperous, filled with customers eager to purchase his family's silk. By the third night, Mikkel had stopped feeling ridiculous. The warmth of the silk had become familiar, expected, almost comforting. And when he made his declaration, "I am abundance," he noticed that his voice carried a different quality. The words didn't feel like lies anymore. They didn't feel like desperate hopes contradicted by harsh reality. They felt like he was remembering something true that he'd temporarily forgotten, like he was reclaiming an identity that had always belonged to him, but had been buried under layers of fear and failure. Nothing had changed yet in his external circumstances. His stall was still nearly empty. His debts were still crushing. His competitors still prospered while he struggled. But something fundamental was shifting in the invisible realm, in the backstage operations of his consciousness, where tomorrow's reality was being constructed from the raw materials of tonight's declarations. On the fourth night, his dream went deeper. He saw himself not just in a prosperous marketplace, but actively creating that prosperity. He watched himself making decisions with absolute confidence, choosing which silks to stock with perfect intuition, negotiating with traders from a position of power rather than desperation. And when he woke the next morning, he noticed something strange. For the first time in months, he felt genuinely excited to go to the marketplace instead of dragging himself there with dread weighing down every step. The fifth night brought the first tangible sign that something in the external world was beginning to respond to what he'd been doing in those sacred moments before sleep. A merchant he'd never seen before stopped at his stall, examined his remaining silk with the eye of a true connoisseur, and made a purchase. It wasn't a huge sale, but there was something in the way the transaction unfolded, smoothly, effortlessly, with a sense of rightness that felt completely different from the desperate, grasping energy that had characterized all his recent attempts at business. By the sixth night, Mikkel was no longer just going through the motions of a practice the old woman had prescribed. He had become genuinely invested in this ritual, this nightly conversation with his unconscious mind through the medium of whispered declarations and warming silk. He could feel that he was participating in something much larger than a simple affirmation exercise. He was engaging with the fundamental mechanisms of how reality gets constructed, how the invisible patterns of thought and belief crystallize into visible circumstances and events. Write, "The silk is warming," in the comments if you can feel somewhere deep in your awareness that what worked for Mikkel isn't some ancient magic that only functioned in a different time and place. It's a principle that's still operating right. Now tonight, in your own threshold moments between waking and sleeping, and then came the seventh night, the completion of the cycle the old woman had prescribed. By this point, Mikkel no longer needed to convince himself to believe in the process. The practice had become natural, almost sacred, when he placed his hand on the silk that night and whispered, "I am abundance," in that threshold moment. Something was fundamentally different. The warmth that spread through the fabric wasn't just physical anymore. It was as if the declaration had become part of his identity, rather than something he was trying to convince himself of. He wasn't affirming abundance. He was recognizing it as a truth that had always existed, just waiting for him to stop contradicting it with his fearful thoughts and failure-focused declarations. What followed in the days and weeks after that seventh night was nothing short of remarkable, though Mikkel himself would insist it wasn't magic or supernatural intervention. It was simply the natural result of aligning his unconscious programming with the reality he actually wanted, instead of continuing to reinforce the reality he feared. Opportunities that had been there all along, but invisible to him, suddenly became obvious. A trading connection he'd overlooked years ago unexpectedly reached out with a proposition. A shipment of extraordinary silks became available at exactly the right moment. And somehow Mikkel knew, not through analysis, but through pure intuition, that this was the right investment to make. His stall began to fill again with quality fabrics. Customers who had long since stopped visiting his section of the marketplace started returning, drawn by something they couldn't quite articulate but could definitely feel. Within 3 months, Mikkel's business had not only recovered, but was surpassing even the success his grandfather had achieved. And the most fascinating part? He wasn't working harder or employing some brilliant new strategy. He was simply operating from a completely different internal state, making decisions from a place of certainty rather than desperation, moving through the marketplace with the confidence of someone who knew, at the deepest level, that abundance was his natural state. But here's what Mikkel came to understand that matters far more than his personal success story. The silk itself hadn't changed. The marketplace hadn't fundamentally transformed. What had shifted was the invisible filter, through which he perceived and interacted with reality. For months, he'd been walking through a world of opportunity while wearing glasses that could only see failure and limitation. Those nightly declarations in the threshold, moment before sleep, had gradually replaced those distorted lenses with clear vision, allowing him to finally see and respond to what had been there all along. The old woman's instructions weren't really about the silk at all. The fabric was just a focal point, a physical anchor for his attention during that crucial moment when his conscious mind was handing control over to his unconscious. What he was actually doing each night was reprogramming the fundamental operating system that determined how he showed up in the world, what opportunities he could recognize, what decisions felt right, what actions he was capable of taking. This is the hidden truth that most people miss when they hear stories of dramatic transformation. They think something external changed, that luck shifted, that circumstances mysteriously rearranged themselves, that the universe suddenly decided to be generous. But that's not what happens. What changes is your internal state, and when your internal state changes, your external reality has no choice but to reorganize itself to match, because you're literally perceiving and interacting with a different world. You're making different choices. You're noticing different possibilities. You're responding with different energy. And the world responds to that shift in ways that can seem miraculous, but are actually just the natural consequence of operating from a transformed consciousness. The practice Mikkel stumbled upon through desperation and the guidance of a mysterious stranger is available to anyone. It doesn't require silk or special objects or perfect conditions. It just requires understanding that those moments before sleep are not throwaway time to be wasted on worry and self-criticism. They're the most valuable moments of your entire day for planting the seeds of who you're becoming, for declaring the reality you want your unconscious mind to weave into existence while you rest. Now let me take you even deeper into understanding exactly why this works at a neurological level, because when you grasp the actual mechanics behind these threshold declarations, you'll never approach bedtime the same way again. Your brain, during that transition from waking to sleeping, isn't just passively shutting and down, it's actively reorganizing itself based on the last instructions it receives from your conscious awareness. Type, "I'm planting new seeds tonight," in the comments if you're beginning to see that every single night you've been programming your tomorrow, and that you can choose what program to run instead of leaving it to random anxious thoughts. What you need to understand is that your sleeping mind isn't just sitting there passively receiving whatever thoughts you happen to have before, drifting off, filing them away in some neutral storage system where they'll sit dormant until morning. That's not how any of this works. Your unconscious during sleep functions more like an amplifier, a cosmic amplifier that takes whatever signal you feed it in that threshold moment and multiplies its power exponentially throughout the night. Think of it like the difference between whispering a word into empty air where it fades immediately versus whispering that same word into a microphone, connected to stadium speakers that broadcast it to thousands of people. When you declare "I am abundance" or "I am failure" in that liminal space between waking and sleeping, you're not just having a thought that passes through your mind and disappears. You're feeding a specific frequency into a system that's designed to amplify and broadcast that frequency throughout your entire unconscious network. And your unconscious mind, remember, is what's actually running the show when it comes to your automatic behaviors, your intuitive decisions, your gut feelings about what opportunities to pursue or avoid, your emotional responses to circumstances, your baseline state of being. So when you feed it the frequency of abundance just before sleep, it spends the next 8 hours amplifying that signal, strengthening neural pathways associated with prosperity and success, activating memories of times when you felt resourceful and capable, preparing your system to recognize and respond to opportunities when they appear. Conversely, when you feed it the frequency of fear and inadequacy, it dutifully amplifies that instead, strengthening the circuits of limitation, activating memories of past failures, priming your system to perpetuate the patterns you're trying to escape. This amplification process is why that specific timing matters so much. During your normal waking hours, you can make declarations and affirmations all day long, but they're competing with 1,000 other signals for your unconscious mind's attention. It's like trying to broadcast a message while every other radio station is also transmitting at full volume. Your signal gets lost in the noise, diluted, drowned out by all the conflicting inputs your senses are processing every second. But in that precise moment, when you're crossing from wakefulness into sleep, something changes in the landscape of your consciousness. All those competing signals start to fade. The external world releases its grip on your attention. Your analytical mind powers down. And suddenly, there's this window of clarity, this brief opening, where whatever message you choose to transmit has the entire stage to itself, uninterrupted, undiluted, ready to be amplified without interference. The ancient practitioners who developed these techniques understood something that neuroscience is only now beginning to map out in detail. They knew there was a specific quality to consciousness in that liminal moment that made it uniquely receptive to intentional programming. They called it different things in different traditions: the twilight of the soul, the gateway of transformation, the threshold of becoming. But they were all describing the same phenomenon. A state where the boundaries between conscious intention and unconscious programming become permeable, where you can slip new instructions past the usual gatekeepers and directly into the operating system. And here's what makes this so powerful for you right now. Today, tonight, when you go to bed, you don't need to become a master meditator or develop some advanced spiritual practice to access this state. You're already experiencing it every single night. You're already crossing through that threshold every time you fall asleep. The only question is whether you're using those precious moments intentionally or whether you're squandering them on the mental garbage of worry, regret, and fear that your mind habitually reaches for when you're exhausted and your defenses are down. Most people treat that transition to sleep as nothing more than the end of consciousness, the point where they finally get to check out and stop thinking. But what if you started treating it as the beginning of your most important work? What if you recognized that those final moments of conscious awareness before sleep aren't the end of your day, but the launching point for the transformation that's going to unfold while you rest? What if you understood that you're not just going to sleep, you're entering the amplification chamber where tomorrow's reality is being constructed based on the instructions you're about to give? The impact of this shift in understanding, this realization that you're standing at the control panel every single night with your hand on the dial that determines what gets amplified in your consciousness, is absolutely revolutionary, because it means you're not helpless. You're not at the mercy of random circumstances or bad luck or unchangeable patterns. You're the one feeding the amplifier. You're the one choosing the signal. You're the one determining whether your unconscious mind spends the night strengthening the circuits of limitation or the pathways of possibility. Drop "I control the amplifier" in the comments if this is landing for you, if you're starting to grasp that you've had your hand on the most powerful lever in your entire life this whole time without realizing what you were holding. Now let me show you this principle from a completely different angle, because sometimes the truth reveals itself most clearly through unexpected comparisons. There was a potter named Brian who lived in what locals called the Valley of 1,000 Furnaces, a region famous for its ceramic traditions going back centuries. Brian was skilled at his craft, no question about that. He'd been trained by masters, knew all the traditional techniques, could throw a perfect vessel on the wheel with his eyes closed. But something drove him to experiment in ways his colleagues thought were absolutely insane. While every other potter in the valley worked during daylight hours, when visibility was good, when they could see exactly what they were doing, when conditions seemed optimal for precision work, Brian started creating his pieces exclusively during the midnight hours. He'd wait until darkness had fully settled, until the rest of the valley was asleep, and then he'd begin his work by candlelight, or sometimes in near total darkness, feeling his way through the creative process more than seeing it. His fellow potters mocked him relentlessly. They called him the shadow craftsman, the midnight fool, the one who'd lost his mind somewhere in the darkness. But what they couldn't mock, what they couldn't explain away or dismiss, were the results. The vessels Brian created during those midnight sessions possessed qualities that defied all conventional understanding of pottery. Water stored in his containers didn't just stay fresh. It somehow tasted clearer, purer, almost alive in a way that water from ordinary vessels didn't. Plants placed in his pots didn't just grow. They flourished with an almost supernatural vitality, producing blooms and fruits far beyond what the same species produced in normal containers. Healers in the valley started seeking out Brian's bowls specifically for preparing medicines, claiming that remedies mixed in his vessels had noticeably amplified potency. They couldn't explain it. Brian himself couldn't fully explain it, but the evidence was undeniable. Something about his midnight creations was fundamentally different from pottery made during ordinary daylight hours. What Brian eventually came to understand through years of experimentation and deep observation was that he'd stumbled onto a profound truth about the nature of consciousness itself, a truth that applies just as much to human transformation as it does to working with clay. He discovered that clay, like human consciousness, exists in different states depending on conditions. During the day, exposed to heat and light and constant activity, clay hardens. It becomes rigid, resistant, difficult to work with. If you try to shape clay that's been sitting in the sun, it cracks and breaks. It fights your efforts to mold it into new forms. But at night, when the temperature drops and moisture returns to the air, when the intensity of daytime energy finally dissipates, the clay recovers its natural malleability. It becomes soft again, receptive, ready to take whatever shape the potter's hands guide it into. And Brian realized that human consciousness follows exactly the same pattern. During your waking hours, your consciousness is like clay baking in the hot sun of constant stimulation, endless decisions, perpetual worry and analysis. It hardens into fixed patterns, rigid beliefs, resistant structures that fight against any attempt to reshape them. This is why personal transformation feels so difficult during the day. You're essentially trying to mold sun-baked clay with your bare hands, attempting to force change through sheer willpower while working with material that's in its most rigid, resistant state. You can push and strain and exhaust yourself trying to create new patterns, but the clay of your consciousness is simply too hard to work with effectively. It cracks under pressure instead of yielding to transformation. But when night comes and you enter that threshold state, before sleep, something miraculous happens. The heat of daytime consciousness dissipates, the harsh light of analytical thinking dims, and your consciousness recovers its natural malleability, its original softness, its inherent readiness to be shaped into whatever form you intentionally guide it toward. This is the secret Brian discovered in his pottery that translates directly to the work you're doing with your own mind. In that liminal moment before sleep, you're not working with hardened, resistant material. You're working with consciousness in its most receptive state, ready to take the impression of whatever declarations you make, whatever intentions you plant, whatever identity you claim. The same consciousness that would fight and resist your efforts at transformation during the day becomes perfectly pliable, perfectly moldable, perfectly responsive to your intentional shaping when approached at the right time, under the right conditions. Brian learned to work with clay when it was soft and receptive rather than fighting against it when it was hard and resistant. And the vessels he created during those midnight hours, when both the clay and his own consciousness were in their most malleable states, carried a quality that daylight creation could never replicate. They were infused with something deeper, something that resonated at a frequency beyond the merely physical. Write, "My consciousness is soft clay" tonight in the comments if you're recognizing that you've been trying to transform yourself at the wrong time, fighting against hardened patterns when you could be working with the natural malleability that's available to you every night in that threshold moment. What Brian also discovered through his midnight pottery sessions was something even more subtle but equally crucial to your nighttime transformation work. There's a perfect pressure, a precise balance point between too much force and too little, between pushing too hard and not applying enough. Intention. When you're working with soft clay on the potter's wheel, if you press too aggressively, the whole piece collapses or cracks under the pressure. But if you're too tentative, too gentle, the clay never takes any definite shape at all. It just spins formlessly on the wheel, never becoming anything specific. This same principle applies directly to how you work with your consciousness in that threshold moment before sleep. There's a quality of intention that's neither forceful straining nor passive wishing. It's more like a gentle but confident assertion, a relaxed certainty rather than desperate grasping. When you whisper, "I am abundance," or whatever declaration resonates with the transformation you're seeking, you're not supposed to be tensing up, gritting your teeth, trying to convince yourself through sheer force of will. That's too much pressure. That's the daytime approach of fighting against resistant material. But you also can't be wishy-washy about it, half-heartedly, mumbling words you don't really believe while secretly doubting the whole process. That's too little pressure. That's not giving your unconscious mind anything substantial enough to amplify and work with throughout the night. The perfect pressure is somewhere in between, a calm, clear declaration, made with genuine conviction, but without strain or desperation. It's the touch of a master craftsman who knows exactly how much pressure to apply because they've developed a feel for the material they're working with. And this brings me to another story that illustrates this principle from yet another angle, because the more perspectives you see this truth through, the more deeply it integrates into your understanding. There was a fisherman named Daniel who lived in a coastal village where fishing was the primary livelihood for virtually everyone. The daily rhythm was predictable and unchanging. Fishermen would head out at dawn, work the waters during daylight hours when visibility was good and conditions seemed safest, then return in the evening with whatever catch they'd managed to bring in. Daniel completely upended this pattern. While every other fisherman was sleeping, he'd prepare his boat in the darkness and head out into the ocean during those mysterious hours between midnight and dawn. His timing seemed insane to his colleagues. Why would anyone choose to fish when you could barely see? Why work during the hours when most people believed the waters were empty or even dangerous? The other fishermen called him the shadow hunter, the midnight fool, variations on the same theme of mockery that Brian the potter had endured. But just like Brian, Daniel's results silenced the mockery, even if they didn't stop the confusion. His boat consistently returned loaded with fish, not just more fish than the other fishermen caught, but better quality, more valuable species, catches that seemed to defy the supposed laws of when and where certain fish should be available. While his fellow fishermen came back after long days of hard work with nets that were barely half full, Daniel returned from his midnight expeditions with a bounty that suggested he'd tapped into some hidden source the daytime workers couldn't access. What Daniel understood intuitively, what he'd learned through careful observation and experimentation rather than traditional teaching, was that the ocean, during those liminal hours between midnight and dawn, existed in a completely different state than it did during the day. The boundary between worlds became porous, as he described it. The normal rules seemed to loosen their grip. And if you knew how to work with that altered state rather than against it, if you could attune yourself to the rhythms that only revealed themselves in darkness, you could access abundance that remained completely hidden from those operating under ordinary daytime assumptions. He wasn't just fishing in the dark, he was fishing in a different reality, one that only became accessible when the veil between visible and invisible thinned during those sacred hours. And the same principle that allowed Daniel to find fish where others found empty waters is the principle that allows you to access transformation during sleep that remains inaccessible during your waking efforts. The nighttime ocean Daniel navigated wasn't fundamentally different water containing different fish. It was the same ocean his colleagues fished during the day. But in those liminal hours, something about the state of that environment changed in ways that created opportunities invisible to daylight fishing. Your consciousness during that threshold moment before sleep is exactly the same. It's not a different mind or a different you. It's the same consciousness you have during the day, but in a completely different state. One where opportunities for transformation that are invisible and inaccessible during waking hours suddenly become available and responsive. Type, "I'm fishing in deeper waters tonight" in the comments if you're beginning to see that there's a whole realm of possibility available to you in those midnight hours of consciousness that you've been missing by approaching your transformation work at the wrong times, under the wrong conditions. Daniel's secret wasn't just about timing, about being on the water when others were sleeping. It went deeper than that. He'd learned to listen to a language the ocean only spoke after darkness fell, a communication that happened beneath the surface of ordinary perception. During daylight hours, the sea was noisy with activity, boats crisscrossing the waters, wind whipping the surface into chaos, the constant chatter of seabirds, and the mechanical sounds of human industry. Under all that noise, the ocean's true voice was completely drowned out, impossible to hear even if you knew to listen for it. But in those sacred hours between midnight and dawn, when human activity finally ceased and even the wind often calmed to a whisper, Daniel could hear what the ocean was actually saying. He could sense the invisible currents moving beneath the surface, could feel the rhythms and patterns that guided where fish would gather, could attune himself to a frequency of information that simply wasn't accessible through the normal methods of daytime fishing. It wasn't supernatural. It was just subtle, too subtle to perceive when your senses were being bombarded by 1,000 competing signals. What made Daniel truly exceptional, though, wasn't just his ability to perceive these nighttime rhythms. It was his discovery that he could synchronize his own internal state with them. He learned to match his breathing to the rhythm of the waves, to align his heartbeat with the pulse of the tide, to attune his entire being to the same frequency the ocean was operating on during those liminal hours. And when he achieved that synchronization, something remarkable happened. The boundary between himself and the ocean seemed to dissolve. He wasn't fishing in the water anymore. He was part of the water, moving with it, understanding it from the inside rather than trying to conquer it from the outside. This synchronization is exactly what you're doing when you make your declarations in that threshold moment before sleep. You're not trying to force your consciousness to accept something it doesn't believe. You're synchronizing your internal vibration with the frequency of the reality you want to experience. You're tuning yourself to match the rhythm of abundance or health or confidence or whatever quality you're declaring, so that when your unconscious mind takes over during sleep, it naturally gravitates toward experiences and perceptions that resonate with that frequency. One night, as Daniel prepared his boat under a sky blazing with stars, an elderly woman appeared at the dock, someone he'd never seen before in his village, though her eyes suggested she'd witnessed more sunrises and sunsets than seemed possible in a single lifetime. She watched him work in silence for a long moment, then spoke words that would transform his understanding of what he'd been doing all along. She told him he'd been casting the wrong nets, that he was still thinking too much like a daytime fisherman, even though he worked in darkness. The nets that mattered, she explained, weren't woven from rope and fiber. They were woven from intention, from declaration, from the pure vibration of words spoken with absolute conviction in that moment when the veil between worlds was thinnest. She called these invisible tools nets of starlight. And she taught Daniel how to weave them with nothing more than his voice and his certainty. Before casting his physical nets into the water, he was to cast this invisible net first, a net woven from the declaration, "I am abundance," whispered not to the ocean but to himself, to his own consciousness, hovering in that receptive state between full wakefulness and the beginning of sleep's approach. Daniel thought this sounded even crazier than his midnight fishing schedule, but the woman's presence carried such authority, such unshakable knowing, that he decided to try it. That very night, before releasing his physical nets into the dark waters, he stood at the bow of his boat, felt himself settle into that liminal state of consciousness he'd learned to access, even while technically awake, and whispered to the night, "I am abundance." He imagined weaving those words into an invisible net of pure intention and casting it out across the waters before him. What happened next defied everything he thought he understood about fishing. The ocean seemed to respond, not dramatically, not with visible signs or miraculous manifestations, but with a subtle shift in energy that he could feel in his bones. The waters moved differently around his boat. The currents seemed to guide him towards spots he hadn't planned to fish. And when he finally did cast his physical nets, they filled with such abundance that he barely had the strength to haul them back aboard. Night after night, Daniel practiced this technique of weaving invisible nets from his declarations before fishing with physical ones. And night after night, the results reinforced what the old woman had taught him, that reality responds to the vibration you emit, especially when that vibration is broadcast during those sacred hours when the boundaries are thin and the invisible realm is most receptive to reshaping itself according to your declared intentions. Put "I'm weaving invisible nets" in the comments if you're starting to understand that the declarations you make in your threshold moments aren't just positive thinking exercises, they're actual tools for reshaping the invisible patterns that determine what you attract and experience in the physical world. Now, let me take you to an entirely different setting, a different time and place, to show you this same truth operating through yet another lens. In the legendary Library of Alexandria, during the height of its glory as the repository of human knowledge, there was a scribe named Amanda who held a position that most people considered merely ceremonial or even pointless. While other scribes worked during normal daylight hours when visibility was optimal and the light streaming through the windows made reading and writing easy, Amanda was assigned to record the Pharaoh's decrees exclusively during the twilight hours. That liminal time when day surrendered to night and the world hung suspended between two states of being. Her fellow scribes pitied her or mocked her, depending on their disposition. Why would anyone be forced to work in fading light when they could have the clarity of midday sun? What kind of punishment or political slight had landed her with such an impractical assignment? But what they didn't understand, what Amanda herself didn't fully grasp until years into her practice, was that she'd been given the most important job in the entire institution. The decrees she recorded during those twilight hours weren't just administrative documents. They were being inscribed on something far more permanent than papyrus. Amanda would prepare her writing materials as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, mixing her inks with the same ritual precision every evening. And when the Pharaoh's messengers arrived with the day's most crucial proclamations, decisions about resource distribution, declarations of policy, statements of vision for the empire's future, she would begin transcribing them exactly as the light shifted from golden afternoon to dusky purple twilight. There was something about working in that transitional light, in that neither day nor night quality of consciousness it induced, that made her feel as though the words she was writing carried more weight, more reality, than anything written under the harsh certainty of noon. One evening, as she sat in the library's transcription chamber with a particularly important decree half finished, the papyrus before her began to glow with a subtle luminescence that didn't come from any external source. And from that glow, a presence emerged, not quite physical, but undeniably real, a spirit or consciousness that identified itself as the first scribe of the twilight hours, someone who'd held her exact position thousands of years before, when the practice had first been established. This ancient scribe spoke to Amanda with words that would completely transform her understanding of what she'd been doing all those years. The spirit told her she'd been writing on papyrus when she should have been writing on the tablets of eternity. Every word she traced during those sacred twilight moments wasn't just being recorded on the physical material before her. It was being simultaneously inscribed on something vastly more permanent, something the spirit called the eternal record of consciousness itself, the twilight. Hours, this ancient presence explained, were when the veil between the physical and the eternal became as thin as the papyrus paper she wrote upon. During that precise window of transition, consciousness existed in a state where it could write on both realms simultaneously. The Pharaoh's decrees that Amanda recorded weren't just political documents, they were acts of creation, inscriptions on the fabric of reality itself that would shape events and outcomes far beyond what any physical policy could accomplish through ordinary means. This is why the most important proclamations were always given to her to transcribe during twilight, rather than to the daytime scribes. The ancients who'd established this practice understood something profound about how reality gets constructed. Words written during that liminal moment between day and night, between waking consciousness and sleep consciousness, between the visible and invisible worlds. Those words carried a creative power that ordinary daylight writing simply didn't possess, and this is exactly what you're doing when you make your declarations in that threshold moment before sleep. You think you're just talking to yourself, just repeating some affirmations in your head as you drift off. But what you're actually doing is writing on the tablets of eternity. You're inscribing on the eternal record of consciousness that determines what possibilities are available to you, what patterns will manifest in your experience, what version of reality you'll wake up to tomorrow. Every night, in that twilight of your consciousness, when you're crossing from waking to sleeping, you become the scribe. You hold the stylus. And the question is simply this: what are you writing? Are you inscribing declarations of limitation and fear and impossibility? Are you carving into the eternal record more evidence of why things can't change, why you're stuck, why transformation is out of reach? Or are you deliberately, consciously writing declarations of your true nature, your actual potential, the reality you're choosing to experience? The tablets don't care what you write. They don't judge whether your words are true or false, optimistic or pessimistic, empowering or limiting. They simply record faithfully whatever you inscribe during that sacred window when the veil is thin and your words carry the power to shape reality itself. Amanda learned that she wasn't just a scribe copying down political documents. She was a participant in the most fundamental act of creation, the ongoing writing of reality through conscious declaration in liminal moments. Write, "I am the scribe of my destiny," in the comments, if you're recognizing that every night you've been holding the stylus and writing on eternal tablets without realizing the permanence and power of what you've been inscribing in those twilight moments of consciousness. What the ancient scribe helped Amanda understand applies directly to the practical mechanics of how you use this knowledge tonight. It's not enough to know that declarations made before sleep have power. You have to understand that there's a specific moment, a precise instant, when the stylus can actually write on those eternal tablets. Just like Amanda couldn't inscribe those decrees at noon or midnight with the same effect, you can't make your declarations at random times during the night and expect the same results. There's a twilight of your own consciousness, a personal threshold moment that you cross every single night whether you're paying attention to it or not. It's that sensation you know intimately if you stop to notice it. When your thoughts start to drift and lose their linear quality, when the boundaries of your body seem to soften, when you're still somewhat aware but reality is beginning to blur around the edges. That's your twilight. That's when the veil in your consciousness becomes thin enough for your words to write on both sides of reality simultaneously. Most people blow right through this moment without giving it any conscious attention. They're either still fully awake, mind racing with the day's concerns, or they've already crossed completely into sleep without marking that threshold passage at all. But when you learn to catch that exact moment, when you develop the sensitivity to recognize, here it is, right now, I'm in the twilight, that's when your declarations carry maximum creative power. That's when what you write actually inscribes itself on the eternal record instead of just floating through your mind and dissipating like morning mist. And to show you how this principle operates in yet another context, let me take you to a small village perpetually wrapped in coastal mists, where a baker named Stephanie had discovered something about the relationship between intention, timing, and manifestation that would make her bread legendary throughout the entire region. While every other baker in the village followed the traditional schedule, preparing dough in the late afternoon, letting it rise overnight, then baking in the early morning, Stephanie did everything backwards in a way that seemed to make no practical sense. She would begin her work in the deepest hours of night, mixing her flour and water and yeast in complete darkness or by the faint light of a single candle. And as she kneaded each batch of dough, as her hands worked the ingredients into their proper consistency, she would whisper to the dough itself. Not prayers exactly, not spells or incantations, but specific intentions tailored to who the bread was for and what purpose it would serve. For a family struggling with scarcity, she whispered, "Abundance flows through you into the dough." For someone seeking healing, perfect health rises within you. For lovers getting married, joy multiplies in your union. The other bakers in the village dismissed her as eccentric at best, mentally unstable at worst. Talking to dough? Working in darkness when you could barely see what you were doing? What possible advantage could come from making everything so much more difficult than it needed to be? But what they couldn't dismiss, what eventually drew customers from villages miles away, was the undeniable quality of Stephanie's bread. It wasn't just that it tasted better, though it did. It was that consuming her bread seemed to carry actual effects that went far beyond normal nutrition. Families who ate her abundance bread reported unexpected windfalls and opportunities. People recovering from illness who consumed her healing loaves experienced faster recoveries than their physicians could explain. The wedding bread she baked seemed to bless marriages with unusual harmony and longevity. And the most remarkable aspect, the bread Stephanie pulled from her ovens just as the first rays of dawn touched the horizon, carried a luminosity, a quality of light, that no other baker's products possessed, even when made with identical ingredients and techniques. What Stephanie understood intuitively, what she'd discovered through years of experimentation in those quiet pre-dawn hours, was that ingredients are receptive in darkness in a way they're not in light. The dough she worked with during those deep night hours existed in a state similar to your consciousness in that threshold moment before sleep, soft, malleable, undefended, ready to receive and hold whatever intention was planted in it. And the timing mattered critically. Mixing dough in the afternoon with the same intentions didn't produce the same results. The liminal quality of the deep night hours, combined with the rising that happened in darkness and the baking that coincided with dawn's arrival, created a complete cycle of transformation that mirrored the cycle your consciousness goes through from twilight to sleep to waking. She was essentially doing with bread what you're learning to do with your own consciousness, planting specific intentions in receptive material during the exact window when that material is most capable of absorbing and manifesting those intentions. The fact that her medium was dough and yours is your own mind doesn't change the underlying principle. Both are forms of consciousness. Both become maximally receptive during specific conditions, and both will manifest whatever intentions are planted in them during those optimal moments. Type "My intentions are rising like dough" in the comments if you're seeing how all these different examples from different contexts, silk merchants, potters, fishermen, scribes, bakers, are all pointing to the same fundamental truth about timing, receptivity, and the power of intention planted in liminal moments. What Stephanie eventually learned, what was revealed to her by yet another mysterious elder who seemed to appear exactly when the teaching was needed most, took her practice to an entirely different level of understanding. This woman, appearing at Stephanie's bakery in the pre-dawn hours as if summoned by the bread itself, watched her work in silence before speaking words that would unlock the deepest secret of the whole process. She said something that sounds simple, but contains layers of meaning that could take a lifetime to fully unpack. The dough rises because you rise first in consciousness. At first, Stephanie thought this was just poetic language, a nice metaphor about positive thinking or confidence. But the old woman insisted she was being completely literal. The physical rising of the dough, the expansion and transformation of those simple ingredients into something greater than their separate parts, was actually a mirror reflection of what was happening in Stephanie's own consciousness during those nighttime hours of preparation. When she whispered intentions into the dough, she wasn't magically infusing the bread with special properties. She was raising her own consciousness to a frequency that the dough then reflected and embodied. The intentions she planted during the darkness expanded along with the dough as it rose, developing substance and power in that hidden process that happened while everything rested. By the time the bread went into the oven at dawn, those intentions had become so thoroughly integrated into the material that they couldn't be separated from it anymore. They'd become part of the bread's essential nature, which is why consuming it had effects that went beyond normal nutrition. People were literally taking in transformed consciousness, elevated intention made manifest in physical form. This is exactly what's happening with your nighttime declarations, though you're both the baker and the bread in this scenario. When you whisper, "I am abundance," or "I am health," or whatever truth you're declaring in that twilight moment, you're not just stating something you hope will become true. You're raising your own consciousness to the frequency of that reality. And then, while you sleep, while you rest in the darkness just like dough rising in a bowl covered with cloth, that elevated consciousness is expanding, developing substance, integrating itself so thoroughly into your being that by morning it's become part of who you are, rather than just an idea you're trying on. This brings me to one final story that ties all these threads together in a way that reveals the ultimate principle behind everything we've been exploring. High in the remote mountain valleys of Nepal, in regions so isolated that most people never even knew they existed, there was a man named Joshua who tended gardens that seemed to violate every known law of agriculture and botany. While everyone else in the scattered mountain communities planted their gardens during daylight hours in the traditional way, Joshua worked exclusively at night, often in total darkness or by nothing more than faint moonlight. He would take each seed individually, hold it in his palm, and speak to it before planting, not general blessings or vague hopes for good growth, but specific detailed declarations about what that particular seed would become and what purpose it would serve. For a healing herb, he might whisper, "You are medicine that restores what has been broken. You are the bridge between illness and wholeness." For a food crop, "You are nourishment that sustains life abundantly. You are provision that never runs short." He spoke with such conviction, such absolute certainty, that anyone listening would think he was talking to a person rather than a tiny seed. The monks from nearby monasteries would sometimes make the difficult journey to Joshua's remote valley just to witness the results of his midnight planting. The herbs that grew in his gardens possessed healing properties far beyond what the same species produced elsewhere. The vegetables achieved sizes and nutritional density that agricultural experts couldn't explain. Flowers bloomed in colors that botanists insisted shouldn't be possible for their species. And everything he grew seemed to thrive with minimal care, as if the plants themselves had been so thoroughly programmed with their purpose that they needed little external support to fulfill it. What Joshua had discovered through decades of patient experimentation was that seeds, like human consciousness, are most receptive to programming in darkness. During daylight, a seed is dormant, defensive, its potential locked away behind protective walls. But in the darkness of night, especially in that soil that mirrors the darkness of the unconscious mind, seeds open up to receive instruction about what they're meant to become. The declarations he whispered weren't imposing something foreign onto the seed. They were activating the seed's own deepest potential, calling forth possibilities that had always been there, but needed the right conditions and the right frequency of intention to manifest. Put "I'm planting in the darkness" in the comments if you're understanding that your consciousness during sleep is exactly like those seeds Joshua worked with. Most receptive in darkness, capable of extraordinary growth when given clear instructions in the right conditions, ready to manifest potential that's been there all along, just waiting for you to activate it with your twilight declarations. One night, as Joshua knelt in his garden planting by moonlight, a presence materialized among his carefully tended rows, a being that seemed composed of living light and ancient earth, as if the consciousness of the garden itself had taken form to speak with him. This luminous entity shared something with Joshua that would forever change his understanding of why darkness was so essential to his method. It told him that all seeds dream of what they will become, but only those planted in the soil of night remember their cosmic origins. During daylight planting, the being explained, seeds are planted in a state of distraction. the light, the activity, the bustle of ordinary agricultural work. All of it keeps the seed focused on its immediate physical circumstances, on the survival challenges of germination and growth. But seeds planted in darkness, especially when spoken to with clear intention in that quiet nocturnal space, connect with something far deeper. They remember not just their potential to become a particular plant, but their connection to the infinite creative force that makes all growth possible. They tap into what the luminous being called their cosmic memory, the blueprint of perfect expression that exists beyond the limitations of ordinary botanical expectations. This is why Joshua's plants exceeded normal parameters. They weren't just growing according to their genetic programming. They were accessing a level of potential that exists in every seed, but rarely gets activated because the conditions for that activation, darkness, intentional declaration, the absence of distraction, are so rarely provided. And your consciousness, during that threshold moment, before sleep operates on exactly the same principle, in the darkness of that liminal state, free from the constant distraction of sensory input and conscious analysis, you can access your own cosmic memory, your own deepest blueprint of what you're actually capable of becoming. The declarations you make in that moment aren't creating something from nothing. They're reminding your consciousness of what it has always been capable of, calling forth potential that's been there since before you accumulated all your limiting beliefs and contradictory evidence. You're planting yourself in the soil of night, giving yourself permission to remember your infinite potential rather than being confined to the narrow identity that daytime consciousness has constructed from past experience and fear. But there's one more layer to this that brings together everything we've explored so far. And it involves understanding that consciousness itself is fundamentally vibrational, fundamentally sound, fundamentally frequency. In the ancient valleys of Kashmir, where mist and mountain met in ways that seemed to blur the boundary between earth and sky, there lived a woman named Melissa who'd spent her entire life exploring the relationship between sound and transformation. She worked with crystal singing bowls, 7 of them tuned to specific frequencies, arranged in a spiral pattern inside a natural cave whose shape had been refined over centuries to create perfect acoustic resonance. When Melissa played these bowls during ordinary daytime hours, the sound was beautiful, meditative, calming. People would leave her sessions feeling relaxed and centered, but she knew there was something more, something deeper, that the sound could access if only she could find the right conditions. Then, one evening, as twilight settled over the valley and she was preparing for a session, she felt called to begin playing at an unusual time, not during the day when people were fully alert, but during that exact threshold moment when consciousness was beginning its transition toward sleep. The results were so dramatically different that at first she thought something must have changed with the bowls themselves or the acoustics of the cave. The same frequencies that had been merely pleasant during daylight hours became absolutely transformative when played during the twilight threshold. People didn't just relax, they reported profound shifts in their consciousness. Healings of conditions that had resisted all other treatments, insights that resolved problems that had plagued them for years, feelings of connection to something vast and eternal that stayed with them long after the session ended. What Melissa discovered was that sound operates on consciousness differently depending on the state of that consciousness. During waking hours, when the mind is active and defended, sound can soothe or energize or focus, but it can't penetrate to the deepest levels, where fundamental reprogramming happens. But when consciousness is in that liminal state, when the guardian is drowsy and the boundaries are dissolving, sound becomes a direct pathway to transformation at the most foundational level. Right, I hear the frequency of change in the comments. If you're beginning to understand that your nighttime declarations aren't just words, They're sound frequencies that penetrate your consciousness at the exact moment when that consciousness is most capable of being restructured by vibration. What Melissa came to understand through years of working with these sonic frequencies was that your voice, when used in that twilight moment before sleep, functions exactly like her crystal bowls. Every word you speak is fundamentally a vibration, a specific frequency that ripples through the medium of your consciousness. And when that vibration is introduced at the precise moment when your consciousness is in its most receptive state, when the cave of your mind has the perfect acoustic properties for amplification, those sound waves don't just pass through and disappear. They resonate, they amplify, they restructure the very patterns of your awareness at the deepest levels. This is why the specific words you choose matter, but the conviction with which you speak them matters even more. Melissa discovered that the same frequency played with hesitation or doubt produced completely different effects than when played with absolute certainty. The bowls themselves didn't change. The sound waves they produced were technically identical, but the consciousness receiving those waves could somehow detect the quality of intention behind them, and it responded accordingly. When she played with full conviction, with complete certainty in the transformative power of the sound, the effects were exponentially stronger. Your nighttime declarations work the same way. When you whisper, "I am abundant," with uncertainty, with that subtle internal questioning of whether it's really true, you're essentially playing a pure frequency but muddying it with static. The sound reaches your unconscious mind, but it's garbled, unclear, mixed with contradictory signals. Your consciousness doesn't know which instruction to follow, the words you're saying or the doubt you're feeling while saying them. But when you make that same declaration with genuine conviction, even if your external circumstances seem to contradict it completely, you're sending a clean, clear signal that your unconscious mind can receive and act upon without confusion. Melissa also discovered something fascinating about repetition and rhythm. When she played the same frequency pattern night after night during that twilight threshold, the effects didn't just accumulate, they multiplied. It was as if each session prepared the consciousness to receive the next one even more deeply, creating a spiral of ever-increasing receptivity and transformation. The seventh session wasn't 7 times as powerful as the first. It was exponentially more powerful, because the previous 6 had progressively opened pathways that allowed the sound to penetrate to levels that were completely inaccessible initially. This is the principle behind why consistent practice matters so much with your nighttime declarations. One night of declaring, "I am worthy," in that threshold moment will have some effect. 7 consecutive nights will have an effect far beyond 7 times that initial impact. Not because you're just repeating the same thing, but because each night's declaration prepares your consciousness to receive tomorrow night's declaration even more deeply, clearing away layers of resistance, opening channels that were previously blocked, creating neural pathways that get stronger and more established with each repetition. What emerged from Melissa's work was a complete understanding that transformation isn't about forcing change through willpower or positive thinking. It's about finding the exact frequency that consciousness needs to hear, delivering that frequency at the precise moment when consciousness is most receptive to receiving it, and then repeating that process consistently enough that the new frequency becomes the default setting rather than an occasional override of the usual programming. She taught people to think of their nighttime declarations not as attempts to convince themselves of something they don't believe, but as tuning forks that help their consciousness find its natural resonant frequency. Just like a tuning fork will cause a nearby string to vibrate at the same pitch through resonance, Your declarations in that liminal moment cause your entire consciousness to begin resonating at the frequency of whatever you're declaring. And as that resonance strengthens through repetition, what seemed like a lie or a fantasy when you first started gradually becomes the most natural, obvious truth about who you are. The cave where Melissa worked had been shaped over centuries specifically to amplify certain frequencies. But your consciousness during that threshold moment is already the perfect amplification chamber. You don't need to create special conditions or find sacred spaces. You just need to recognize that every single night, for those few moments when you're crossing from waking to sleeping, you're standing inside the most sophisticated resonance chamber in the universe. And the question is simply whether you're going to use it intentionally, or let it amplify whatever random frequencies happen to be playing in your worried, anxious, fear-focused mind. Type, "I'm tuning to my true frequency" in the comments if you're ready to start using your voice as a precision instrument for consciousness transformation, rather than letting it broadcast the same old static of limitation and fear. Now let me bring this understanding to an even deeper level, because there's a dimension to all of this that connects every single story and principle we've explored. A master who worked with Melissa during her years of sonic exploration revealed something that sounds abstract at first, but becomes immediately practical once you really grasp it. Your words, this master explained, aren't simply mental concepts or linguistic symbols that exist in some separate realm of meaning. At their most fundamental core, they are pure sound, pure vibration that propagates through the medium of your consciousness exactly like waves expanding outward. From where a stone falls into perfectly still water. Think about that image for a moment. When a stone breaks the surface of completely calm water, it creates ripples that move outward in perfect circles, touching everything in their path. Those ripples carry information about the stone, its weight, its shape, the force with which it entered the water, and they reorganize everything they touch, shifting the position of every molecule in that expanding circle. Your words during that twilight threshold work exactly the same way. When you declare "I am health" or "I am prosperity," in that moment of perfect receptivity, you're dropping a stone of pure intention into the still waters of your unconscious mind. And the ripples from that declaration expand outward through your entire consciousness, touching and reorganizing every belief, every pattern, every behavioral program they encounter. But here's what makes this even more powerful. Those ripples don't stop at some arbitrary boundary. They keep expanding, keep touching, keep reorganizing, potentially forever, unless they meet some obstacle that blocks their movement. In perfectly still water with no obstacles, the ripples from a single stone can eventually reach the furthest edges of the pond. In your consciousness during sleep, when all the usual obstacles and resistances are dissolved, the ripples from your nighttime declarations can reach and reorganize aspects of your being that would be completely inaccessible if you tried to change them through daytime effort. This brings me to what might be the most profound story of all, because it reveals the ultimate truth about what you're actually doing when you work with your consciousness during these sacred nighttime hours. In the same Kashmir valleys where Melissa discovered the power of sound, there was a woman named Christina who practiced what the locals called the art of cosmic weaving. She didn't work with thread or fabric in any ordinary sense. Her loom existed only in consciousness, and what she wove were the invisible threads that constitute reality itself. Christina had come to understand something that most people never grasp in their entire lifetime. Reality isn't the solid, fixed, immutable structure we think it is. When you look around at your life, at your circumstances, your relationships, your health, your bank account, it seems utterly concrete, unchangeable, except through massive physical effort over long periods of time. But Christina saw through that illusion. She understood that everything you experience as solid reality is actually woven from invisible threads of pure consciousness, and that those threads can be unwoven and rewoven by anyone who learns the secret art of working with them in their natural state. During daylight hours, reality appears fixed because consciousness is in its hardened state. Remember? The clay has baked in the sun, the threads have set into seemingly permanent patterns. But during the nighttime hours, especially in that threshold moment and throughout the deep sleep that follows, those threads become fluid again. They can be unwoven from old patterns and rewoven into entirely new configurations. This is what your unconscious mind is actually doing while you sleep. It's literally reweaving the fabric of your reality based on the pattern you gave it in that final conscious moment before crossing into sleep. Christina would teach people to visualize this process. She'd have them imagine their consciousness as a vast loom, and their nighttime declarations as instructions for which threads to pull, which patterns to dissolve, which new designs to weave into being. The people who grasped this and practiced it consistently reported transformations that seemed miraculous to outside observers, but were simply the natural result of working with reality at its most fundamental level, the level of pure consciousness before it crystallizes into fixed form. What you're learning here isn't metaphor or mythology. It's the actual mechanics of how your experienced reality gets constructed night after night while you sleep. Every morning when you wake up, you're waking into a reality that was woven during the night, based on the pattern your consciousness was following. And the pattern your consciousness follows during sleep is determined primarily by what you declared in that threshold moment before crossing over. Write, "I'm weaving new reality tonight," in the comments if you're understanding that you're not just thinking positive thoughts or hoping for change. You're actually participating in the fundamental creative process that weaves the fabric of your experienced reality. What Christina taught that transforms this from interesting theory into practical application is the understanding that each night's declaration isn't working in isolation. When you whisper your intention in that threshold moment tonight, you're not starting from scratch. You're adding a new thread to a tapestry that's already in progress. Every previous night's declaration has already woven certain patterns into the fabric of your consciousness, and tonight's declaration interweaves with all of those existing threads, creating something increasingly rich and complex with each passing night. This is why the practice of 7 consecutive nights holds such power across virtually every wisdom tradition that's ever explored these principles. 1 night plants a seed, yes. 2 nights begins to establish a pattern. 3 nights starts to overcome the momentum of old programming, but by the 7th night, something complete has been created. You've woven a full tapestry that contains within itself the exact blueprint of the reality you've been declaring. It's no longer just an intention or a hope. It's become a new structure in your consciousness that your waking mind now has to organize itself around. Think of it like this. On the first night, you're laying down a single thread on an empty loom. It's there, but it's fragile, easily lost among all the other threads of old patterns. By the 3rd night, you've got enough threads that a pattern is starting to emerge, barely visible but present. By the 5th night, the pattern is undeniable. Anyone looking at the loom can see what's being created. And by the 7th night, you've completed a section of tapestry so substantial that it can't be ignored or undone without deliberate effort to unweave it. This cumulative building effect is why consistency matters far more than intensity. 1 night of declaring your intention with tremendous force and then abandoning the practice won't produce lasting results. But 7 nights of gentle, consistent declarations in that threshold moment will restructure your consciousness at foundational levels, because you're giving your unconscious mind a clear, repeated instruction that it can't dismiss as a random thought or momentary enthusiasm. And here's where we arrive at, perhaps, the most ancient understanding of this entire process, one that goes back to the very roots of human exploration into consciousness and transformation. In remote mountains, far from any civilization, there lived a man named Aaron, who'd spent decades studying what the old texts called alchemy. But unlike most people who read those ancient manuscripts and thought they were literally about turning lead into gold through chemical processes, Aaron understood that the language of alchemy was symbolic, pointing towards something far more valuable than physical gold. What he discovered through years of solitary practice and deep contemplation was that the alchemists of old weren't confused scientists who didn't understand chemistry. They were sophisticated explorers of consciousness who discovered the same truth we've been circling around through all these stories. The base metals they talked about transforming, lead, copper, tin, these were symbols for the heavy, limiting states of human consciousness: fear, doubt, shame, unworthiness, all the dense emotional and mental patterns that weigh down your spirit and keep you trapped in limited experience. And the gold they sought to create wasn't a precious metal at all. It was the luminous expression of human potential when consciousness is freed from its limitations and allowed to manifest its true nature. The secret they discovered, the great work that traditional alchemists spent their lives pursuing, was that this transformation could only occur in one specific environment, the perfect crucible of the sleeping mind, during those sacred hours when the conscious guardian steps aside and the deep work of transmutation can proceed without interference. Aaron realized that every night, when you cross that threshold into sleep, you're entering the alchemist's laboratory. Your consciousness in that state becomes the perfect crucible where lead can actually become gold, where the heaviest emotions and most limiting beliefs can be transmuted into their highest expression. But this transformation doesn't happen automatically just because you're asleep. It requires the alchemist to add the right catalyst at the right moment. And that catalyst is your intentional declaration in the threshold moment, the precise verbal formula that initiates the transformation process. When you whisper, "I am worthy," as you drift off, and your consciousness is in that perfect state of receptivity, you're not trying to convince yourself of something that contradicts your feelings. You're adding the catalyst that will allow the alchemical process to transform the lead of unworthiness into the gold of genuine self-recognition during the hours of sleep that follow. The heavy metal dissolves, its elements rearrange at the molecular level of consciousness, and what emerges by morning is genuinely different, not through forced positive thinking, but through actual transmutation at the deepest levels of your being. Type, "I'm in the alchemist's laboratory right now," in the comments, if you're recognizing that every single night you have access to the exact same transformation chamber that the ancient masters spent lifetimes seeking, and that you can activate it simply by knowing what to declare in that precious threshold moment. What Aaron came to understand through his alchemical studies was that the formula itself mattered enormously. The ancient texts always emphasized precise verbal formulations, specific phrases that had to be spoken in exact sequence. Modern readers dismiss this as superstition or obsessive ritual, but Aaron discovered there was profound wisdom in that precision. The most powerful formula, the one that appeared again and again across different traditions and languages, was always some variation of the same 2 words, "I am." Those 2 words, spoken in that threshold moment, function as the universal catalyst for transmutation. When you say, "I am afraid," you're using the formula to Transmute your consciousness into the frequency of fear. When you say, "I am unworthy," you're catalyzing the transformation of your potential into limitation. But when you consciously, deliberately declare, "I am powerful," or "I am abundant," or "I am whole," in that sacred moment before sleep, you're using the exact same alchemical formula to transmute the lead of limitation into the gold of possibility. The fear that's been paralyzing you during daylight hours, that heavy, dense emotion that feels like a weight in your chest, making every decision feel impossible, that's the lead. The doubt that whispers you're not capable, not smart enough, not worthy of success. That's the oxidized copper, tarnished and corroded from years of negative reinforcement. The constant worry that keeps you up at night, that fragile, brittle anxiety that shatters your peace at the slightest provocation. That's the tin. All of these base metals of consciousness, these limiting states that have defined your experience for so long, they're not permanent. They're not who you really are. They're just the current state of elements that can be transmuted into something entirely different. And the transmutation happens not through fighting against these states during the day, not through trying to logic your way out of fear or force yourself to feel confident when you don't. It happens through the precise application of the "I am" formula during sleep, when your consciousness is in that perfect crucible, state where deep transformation becomes possible. You declare the gold: "I am courage, I am certainty, I am peace." And then you surrender to sleep, allowing the alchemical process to work throughout the night, rearranging the fundamental elements of your consciousness until what was lead has genuinely become gold. Aaron would tell people that the transformation isn't metaphorical. It's not that you feel a little better or think more positive thoughts. It's that your actual neurological patterns reorganize, your actual hormonal responses shift, your actual perceptual filters change. What terrified you last week literally doesn't trigger the same response after the transmutation has occurred, not because you're pretending to be brave, but because the base metal of fear has been transformed into the gold of authentic courage at the deepest levels of your being. So here we are, at the threshold of something that could change everything for you starting tonight. Every story I've shared, every principle we've explored, every angle we've examined this truth from, it all converges on this single moment that's about to arrive for you in just a few hours, when you lay your head on your pillow and feel that familiar sensation of consciousness beginning to soften and slide towards sleep. But tonight is different. Tonight, that moment will no longer be like all the thousands of nights that came before it. All those wasted opportunities when you crossed that threshold unconsciously, allowing random fears and worries to be the last program your unconscious mind received. Tonight, you have the knowledge that silk merchants and fishermen and potters and scribes and bakers and gardeners and alchemists spent lifetimes discovering. You understand about the guardian stepping aside, about consciousness becoming malleable like clay, about the amplifier that multiplies whatever signal you feed it, about writing on eternal tablets and weaving cosmic tapestries and transmuting base metals into gold. You know that you have access to the exact same laboratory, the same loom, the same crucible that transformed the lives of everyone whose story you've heard today. Put "Tonight I begin the great work" in the comments if you're feeling that shift happening inside you right now. That recognition that you're standing at the beginning of your own transformation journey, and that the first step starts the moment you close your eyes tonight. The question now is what you're going to do. With this knowledge, you could treat it like interesting information, something you found compelling while watching, but that gradually fades from memory as the day goes on. Or you could actually use it tonight, could actually stand at that threshold with intention instead of crossing it unconsciously like you've done every night before. The choice, as always, is yours. But if you've made it this far with me, if you've stayed through every story and every principle we've explored together, then Something in you already knows this isn't just another video you stumbled across. This is information you were meant to find at exactly this moment in your journey. And if that resonates with you, I'd invite you to subscribe to this channel, because what we've covered today is just the beginning. There are deeper layers to this, more advanced techniques, additional perspectives that build on this foundation in ways that will take your practice to levels we haven't even touched on yet. Leave a comment below, just write, "This message was meant for me," if you feel that sense of recognition, that knowing that you were supposed to be here today, learning exactly this. I read every single comment, and there's something powerful about declaring your intention publicly, about marking this moment as significant rather than letting it pass unmarked. And if this video gave you something valuable, if it shifted something in your understanding, or gave you a tool you can actually use, starting tonight, hit that like button. It helps this message reach other people who need to hear it, who are ready for it, who've been searching for exactly this piece of the puzzle without knowing what they were looking for. Before you go, there's another video right here that goes even deeper into the practical mechanics of how to craft your specific declarations for maximum impact. Click on it and continue with me there, because the journey we started together today deserves to be completed.